Washington's army stood on the banks of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, and the river refused to let them cross. Massive sheets of ice, driven by days of freezing wind and sleet, had locked together into a barrier that no Durham boat could penetrate. The plan had been desperate from the start: a surprise nighttime crossing in the dead of winter, an attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton before dawn. But the Delaware, swollen and choked with ice far worse than anyone had predicted, turned desperation into impossibility. For hours, Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners, the same fishermen and sailors who had saved the army at Brooklyn, fought the frozen river. They pushed boats into channels only to watch ice close behind them. Oars snapped against jagged floes, men waded into freezing water to shove debris aside, and still the barrier held. By 3 in the morning, with the element of surprise long gone and frostbite setting in among the ranks, Washington gave the order no one wanted to hear: turn back. The crossing was abandoned. The other two columns fared no better. General James Ewing's force at Trenton Ferry never launched. Colonel John Cadwallader's militia near Bristol couldn't get their artillery across. The three-pronged attack dissolved into nothing, and on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, 2,400 frozen, exhausted men stumbled back to their camps, knowing they had just failed at what their commander called the last gamble the Revolution could afford. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. But what none of them understood yet, what wouldn't become clear for weeks, was that the river hadn't just stopped a battle. It had stopped a nation from being born. The calendar was as lethal as any British musket. Most enlistments in the Continental Army were set to expire on December 31st, 1776, and without a victory to rally around, Washington had nothing to offer the men who were counting the days. He tried. On the morning of December 26th, still reeling from the failed crossing, Washington addressed his troops personally. He spoke of duty, of the sacrifices already made, of the pamphlet Thomas Paine had published just 6 days earlier. These are the times that try men's souls. He asked them to stay. He promised bounties that Congress might or might not be able to pay. It wasn't enough. The army had been retreating since August. Long Island, White Plains, Fort Washington, Fort Lee, defeat after defeat had ground these men down to nothing. They were starving, many without shoes, sleeping in the open in December. General Charles Lee, one of the most experienced officers in the army, had been captured by the British on December 13th. And now the one bold stroke that might have changed everything had failed before it began. By January 1st, soldiers began walking away. Not in a trickle, in a flood. Entire companies simply dissolved. Men who had marched from New England and Virginia turned their backs and headed home. Washington's force shrank from 2,400 to fewer than 800 in the space of a week. Nathanael Greene, his most trusted general, wrote privately that the army was melting away like snow in April. The Continental Army wasn't defeated in battle. It simply ceased to exist. General William Howe had planned to wait out the winter. That was how wars were fought in the 18th century. You campaigned in warm months and quartered your troops when the cold set in. His chain of outposts stretched across New Jersey from New Brunswick to Trenton, and Colonel Johann Rohl's Hessians sat undisturbed in their garrison. Never attacked, never tested, celebrating a quiet Christmas and a quieter New Year. But intelligence travels fast in occupied territory, and by mid-January, Howe's officers were reporting what Loyalist informants already knew: the Continental Army was disintegrating. The force that had held the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware was a ghost of itself. There was no credible military obstacle between the British outposts and Philadelphia. Howe was a cautious man by nature, but even he recognized an open door. In early February, British and Hessian troops crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania with almost no opposition. The few hundred Continentals, still under arms, fell back without offering battle. Congress had already fled Philadelphia for Baltimore on December 12th, and the city's remaining population, a mix of anxious patriots, quiet loyalists, and people who just wanted to survive, watched British regulars march down Market Street in late February 1777. Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, the seat of the Continental Congress, the place where the Declaration of Independence had been signed barely 7 months earlier, fell without a single shot fired in its defense, and Howe, for once, moved quickly enough to seize a moment that mattered. By March 1777, what remained of the Continental Army could barely be called an army at all. Washington had fewer than 400 men. The stubborn corps, who had refused to leave, held together by loyalty to their commander more than by any rational calculation that the cause could still succeed. They retreated into the hills of western Pennsylvania, beyond the reach of British patrols, but also beyond the reach of supply lines, reinforcements, or hope. Washington established a makeshift camp near the Allegheny country, a position that was defensible only because no one thought it worth attacking. His correspondence from this period reveals a man fighting despair with discipline. He wrote to Congress daily, requesting men, money, supplies. The replies, when they came at all, were filled with sympathy and empty of substance. Congress itself was fracturing. Meeting in Baltimore with dwindling attendance, the delegates faced a reality that no amount of rhetoric could disguise. The Treasury was empty. The states were not sending militia. Several delegates, their names carefully omitted from the official journals, had begun quiet back-channel conversations with British intermediaries, exploring what terms might be available if the fighting stopped. No one called it surrender. They called it exploring the conditions for peace. Washington learned of these contacts through Nathanael Greene, and his reaction was cold fury. But fury without an army is just a man shouting into the wind. 6,000 miles away, Benjamin Franklin sat in a drawing room in Paris and watched his life's work collapse. Franklin had arrived in France in December 1776, charged with the most important diplomatic mission of the war, convincing Louis XVI's government to support American independence with money, arms, and eventually an alliance. His early meetings with Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, France's foreign minister and the architect of a strategy to weaken Britain by supporting the rebellion, had been promising. Vergennes hated the British. He wanted revenge for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. And through the playwright Pierre-Augustin de Beaumarchais and his fictitious trading company, Rodrigue Hortales et Compagnie, France had already been secretly shipping muskets, gunpowder, and cannon to the Americans. But Vergennes was not a fool, and he was not a romantic. He was willing to gamble on American resilience, but he needed evidence that the Americans could actually fight. The news that reached Paris in the spring of 1777 provided the opposite. The Continental Army had dissolved. Philadelphia was in British hands. Congress was scattered and divided. Vergennes summoned Franklin and delivered the message with diplomatic courtesy and brutal clarity. France could not justify intervention on behalf of a revolution that had already failed. The secret arms shipments through Beaumarchais stopped. The doors that had been opening across Versailles quietly closed. Franklin, who understood power better than almost anyone alive, recognized the sound. It was the sound of a cause being abandoned by the only ally that could have saved it. The consequences would prove far greater than anyone in that drawing room imagined. But first, the rebellion had to die on its own terms. The argument that tore the patriot movement apart was not between patriots and loyalists. It was between patriots who wanted to keep fighting and patriots who believed the fighting was over. John Adams, as fierce and stubborn as ever, insisted that resistance must continue. He argued for guerrilla warfare, for spreading the conflict into the frontier, for making British occupation so costly that Parliament would eventually relent. He pointed to the example of the Dutch revolt against Spain, decades of resistance before independence was won. The cause was not dead, he thundered. It was merely in retreat. Others saw it differently. The moderates, and by the spring of 1777, they were the majority of what remained of Congress, looked at the numbers and saw no path forward. No army, no foreign allies, no money. The states were exhausted, their militias unwilling to march, their populations divided. Robert Morris, who had financed much of the war effort from his own pocket, stated plainly that there was nothing left to finance. The choice was not between victory and defeat. The choice was between negotiated terms and unconditional surrender. Congress lost its quorum in April. Delegates simply stopped coming. The body that had declared independence less than a year earlier could no longer muster enough members to conduct business. The revolution, born in debate and sustained by argument, was dying the same way. one empty chair at a time. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Britain's offer arrived in the summer of 1777, carried by commissioners who understood that generous terms now would cost far less than prolonged occupation later. Lord Germain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, had pushed for harsh punishment, but cooler heads in Parliament prevailed. The terms were modelled on what would have been the Carlisle Commission proposals, a framework of reconciliation rather than retribution. The colonies would receive meaningful home rule. Each colonial assembly would govern internal affairs with minimal parliamentary interference. There would be no taxation without colonial consent. Amnesty would be granted to all who had taken up arms against the Crown. With a handful of exceptions, trade restrictions would be loosened, the hated Quartering Act would be repealed. But there would be no independence. The colonies would remain under the sovereignty of King George III. Royal governors would retain veto power, and Britain would maintain the right to regulate external trade and foreign policy. Joseph Galloway, the Loyalist leader who had emerged as a power broker in British-occupied Philadelphia, helped broker the acceptance. State by state, the exhausted colonies agreed, some eagerly, some reluctantly, some with conditions that were quietly ignored. By autumn, most of the former rebel colonies had formally accepted the King's peace. Washington refused. From his diminished camp in western Pennsylvania, he issued a statement declaring that he would never accept terms that extinguished the right of self-governance. Then he rode south to Virginia, to his plantation at Mount Vernon, and into a retirement that looked to most observers permanent. He was watched carefully by British agents for the rest of his life, a defeated general in a defeated cause, dignified in silence. The revolution that failed in 1777 did not vanish. It went underground. Britain held its American colonies, but it held them the way a man holds a live coal, painfully, and not for long without consequence. The resentment that had fueled the rebellion didn't disappear with the King's peace. It settled into the culture like groundwater, invisible but always present. Loyalists who had welcomed the British discovered that their neighbors had long memories. Royal governors who attempted to exercise their veto power found colonial assemblies increasingly willing to simply ignore them. And across the Atlantic, something else failed to happen. France, never drawn into war against Britain, never spent the ruinous sums that in our timeline pushed the monarchy toward bankruptcy. The financial crisis that would have radicalized the French populace and opened the door to revolution in 1789 arrived later, softer, and in a different form. Vergennes' cautions saved the French treasury and perhaps the French crown, at least for a generation. But the ideas survived. Thomas Paine's common sense couldn't be unwritten. Jefferson's Declaration couldn't be unread. In coffeehouses and print shops, in letters passed hand to hand, in the quiet conversations of men and women who remembered what it had felt like to believe that ordinary people could govern themselves. The philosophy of the revolution endured. It crossed oceans. It inspired movements that the men who fought at Long Island and froze on the banks of the Delaware could never have predicted. History turned on a frozen river one Christmas night. The ice held, and a nation waited, not forever, but longer than anyone standing on that dark Pennsylvania shore could have imagined. The question was never whether the idea of self-governance would prevail. The question was only ever when.